Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rabbi Lori Klein. A couple of you look familiar. I was here a few months ago doing a workshop on advanced healthcare directives. And so for those of you who I'm speaking to for the second time, I'm glad that you came back. Welcome to anybody who is here for the first time. I'm speaking as part of a series. I'm one of the chaplains at Stanford Hospital and Clinics, and collectively the Spiritual Care Service is putting on this series of talks called Sacred Conversations. Today's topic is ethical wills, passing on the legacy of your values. And a little bit ways into the workshop, I'll be passing around a handout, but I'm not going to do that just yet. So what is an ethical will? One of my law colleagues in Santa Cruz, who does estate planning, tells me that he hopes that all wills are ethical wills. But this is a term that has been used really for centuries and centuries within Jewish culture and is now really spreading out and being used in many other cultures. And so when we're talking about ethical wills today, what we're talking about is a document that's used to pass values from one generation to the next. And it's about distributing or somehow passing on spiritual wealth as opposed to material wealth. And so, we'll be putting together a list of possible elements of ethical or spiritual wills a bit later. They can be quite a bit broader, almost like a mini memoir in a way. But by the same token, we want to make the task, the goal for all of us is to make a task like composing an ethical will doable. If it becomes really writing a book of your memoirs, you're probably not going to do it. So it's about figuring out what is it that you might want to distill into, however many pages you have the energy to put together. So I'd like to start with a quick exercise. And this exercise is going to involve just a little bit of writing. And I'm really just talking about a few sentences, and then we'll share together, and I'll repeat your answers so that we can make sure that we all hear. So how many people here need a pen or piece of paper? If you could hold your hands up, and Jean will help me distribute. Here, why don't you take that side?
All righty.
And I'll take this side. Okay. Okay, anyone back here? Do you need?
Just paper. Thank you.
Sure. Anybody else? We're good?
Oh.
All right. Here is the exercise. Call to your mind a vision of yourself at the age of 20 years old. So imagine yourself 20 years old again. With what you know now about how your life has unfolded and what you have learned, what is one piece of advice you would give to yourself at 20 if you could do that? Just take a couple minutes and jot down a couple notes. Okay, so let's just take a couple of responses. Let's say 3 responses. If, 3 people who are willing to share what they've written. And for those of you who've just come in, we've just done an exercise on giving ourselves advice, imagining ourselves 20 years old, and from our place here in the present, what advice would we give ourselves at age 20? Yes.
More kindness and love of people, places, and life. Less stress. Oh, balance.
Okay, more kindness, love of people and life, less stress, Om, balance. All right. Yes.
I wrote down, ask for what you want, follow that which calls to you. love and act your family, no matter how challenging.
Okay. I won't remember all of that, but ask for what you want.
Yes.
Be kind to your family. Be open.
Follow that which calls to you.
Follow that which calls to you. That's very important. I want us to hold that for when we talk about this a little bit more in a moment. One more person. Somebody on this side, yes.
Crystallize your goal and work towards it. Don't allow distractions to deter you from reaching your goal.
Okay. Crystallize your goal and don't let things detract from it. Right. Okay. So you might wonder, what I could have done is I could have said, imagine a younger relative, or if you don't have a younger relative, imagine a young person who you know and care about, and write advice to them. So why didn't I do that? Why didn't I ask you to do that? I heard I'll tell you a story and then talk about that a little bit more. So I heard a story on the radio about a woman whose mother died when she was in her teen years, and her mother, it was very difficult for her it was difficult for her to have her mother die, and it was also difficult for her mother to not really take part in her daughter's full growing up. And so what her mother did was she wrote several letters which she put away. So it was almost like, let's say an ethical will in several parts. And she wrote a letter for her daughter to open each year on her birthday, and also on her graduation from college, and also when she got married on her wedding day. And what happened was that initially this was a tremendous source of comfort for the daughter. I mean, she really felt like her mother's voice was still with her, was still guiding her. She felt a sense of closeness. And as time went on, it became more and more difficult for her to open those letters, because her mother had a very fixed idea about what she wanted her daughter to grow up to be. What kind of profession she wanted her to have, and who she wanted her to marry. And in particular, she wanted her daughter to marry somebody within their religious group. And as the daughter got older, she found herself, I believe she became interested in becoming a doctor, which is something that many parents would be happy about, and maybe even her mother would have come to be happy about, but it's not what her mother was urging her to do in the letters. And by the same token, as she fell in love with somebody who was not of their faith group, it was very painful. And in fact, it had become so painful, and she was sharing with her father how these letters were really starting to disturb her, that before her wedding day, her father lost the last letter because he just decided it would be too painful. So, to come back to our exercise, when we write a spiritual will from the perspective of our desires for our younger relatives, we are in that mode to some degree of partly of passing on our own values, but we also are in that mode of control. We all have a desire to control our environment in all kinds of ways, and there might be particular things that we want for our children, our grandchildren, our nieces, our nephews. And if instead we imagine ourselves at a younger age, we tend to grant ourselves more freedom. We tend to give ourselves advice from a place of more freedom, because we've lived this life, and we know that you can't predict everything. And we know that sometimes we end up following our own path. I mean, finding the path that calls to us and really following it. So, as you think about how to create a spiritual will, to the extent that you can, either through an exercise like this or through some other means, that you can shed yourself of the very particular ambition that you have for somebody, and instead really take a step back and think about what you wish you had heard at that age, given your current wisdom. That I think it will take you to a deeper place. Okay, exercise number 2. Now just do a couple of these. So what questions do you wish, if your parents or grandparents are no longer living, what questions do you wish you had asked them before they died? Just think of, a couple of questions. What stories do you wish they had told you and why? Or what advice did you want from them? And again, let's just take a couple of minutes and see what you come up with. What, this will be in the handout, just so you know, but for now, what advice did you want from them? Okay, so again, let's just have a couple of responses. So what are some questions or stories you wish you had asked your parents or grandparents about? One second, let me just see if it's somebody new. Yes?
I would have liked to have asked my father's father more information about our ancestors.
Okay, so more information about your ancestors. So is there something in particular that you wish you had known about your ancestors?
Well, the great-grandfather had come from Germany and the great-grandmother had come from Switzerland.
Okay, so your great-grandfather came from Germany and your great-grandmother came from Switzerland, so maybe how did they meet?
They met in the U.S.
Okay, met in the U.S., all right. So somebody else, yes?
What would you have done differently and why?
Mm-hmm. Okay, what would you have done differently and why? And, one of the ways that you can look at that part of an ethical will where you're talking about your life is to think about turning points. Because when you consider that question, what would you have done differently and why? If we think back over our lives, there are times when we come to different crossroads. We could have gone one way or the other way, and that kind of question is what can help you hone what you might include in your own spiritual ethical will. So was there a hand up here? No? Yes.
What events or decisions in their lives gave them the greatest satisfaction and happiness?
Okay. What events and what events gave them the greatest satisfaction and happiness? And you would want to know that because?
It tells me about them and how that fits with my life.
Okay. All right, so it helps you learn more about them and also about their lives. In preparation for this class, I looked at some books of ethical wills, and one of the things I noticed that I wish people had done more of was people did a lot of that, what has given me satisfaction in life? And I think that is an important component of an ethical will. And I wish almost that some of them would have contained, here are some of the mistakes I made. And how did I live through them? And how did I recover from them? And how did I learn from some of my mistakes? So both of those things. Okay. So I want to give you a little bit of information about the history of ethical wills. So the first ethical will appears in the Hebrew Bible, in the book of Genesis, the end of the book of Genesis, when Jacob is on his deathbed, and he gathers all of his sons around him. Dinah, his only named daughter, is nowhere to be seen, but he gathers all of his sons and his 2 grandsons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And so he gives them what's called a blessing. And so actually, I'll read this a little bit out of order for any of you who are Bible experts. So just so you know, it's out of order. So this is the blessing for Judah. And Jews are named for Yehudah, for Judah. So you, O Judah, your brothers shall praise. Your hand shall be on the nape of your foes. Your father's sons shall bow low to you. Judah is a lion's whelp. On prey, my son, have you grown. He crouches, lies down like a lion, like the king of beasts. Who dare rouse him? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, so that tribute shall come to him, and the homage of peoples be his. So aside from all the flowery language, what are some of the elements of that as a blessing? You know, what is Jacob trying to convey to Judah? Maybe a little bit of prediction about what his future might be. And also his hopes. You know, here are some of my hopes for you. Now that goes back to that place of, that I was talking about before, about how we sometimes have a desire through our hopes to maybe control our children and grandchildren. And I also feel that it helps our children know us, to know what our hopes are for them. So I wouldn't want you to think that it should be completely excluded. It's really more that it's helpful to have somewhat of a balance. So you write some of it from the perspective of what do you wish you had known when you were younger. So you give yourself that more freedom. And then if there are particular hopes and dreams that you have for your children and grandchildren, that also has a place. So then here is his blessing for Shimon and Levi. Shimon and Levi are a pair. Their weapons are tools of lawlessness. Let not my person be included in their council. Let not my being be counted in their assembly. For when angry they slay men, and when pleased they maim oxen. Cursed be their anger so fierce, and their wrath so relentless. I will divide them in Jacob, scatter them in Israel. So let me just say, with blessings like these, who needs curses? I mean, before we back up a little bit and talk about what this means in terms of ethical wills, does anybody remember why Jacob might have been kind of angry with Shimon and Levi? Remember anything about that? So when Joseph was sold into slavery, actually Shimon and Levi were saying, let's kill him. And Joseph also was a son of Jacob. And when Dinah, his only daughter, was, it's a little bit unclear, either sexually assaulted by or engaged in an unapproved love relationship with someone from another culture. Shimon and Levi were the ones who engineered the slaughter of all of the men in that town in Shechem. And so Jacob actually had reason to be angry with them. And from this kind of blessing, deathbed blessing in the Bible, what some of the rabbinic commentators have said is that when you're at the end of your life, it's a time for truth-telling, even if the truth is unpleasant. And that it's also a time when you can engage in what in Hebrew is called tochacha, which means rebuke. So I wanted you to know that because I wanted you to know that that really is part of the history of what ethical wills are. I think the way that we tend to talk about what happens towards the end of one's life now, we really talk more in terms of repairing relationships, not taking one last opportunity to yell at somebody. But I think what we can learn from it is, one of the things I notice just about all of us humans is we spend a lot of time on image management, wanting to project a good image. We have a different persona at different times. And that I think that a useful thing to take from this pretty harsh language of Jacob is that there comes a time when it might be more helpful to drop the masks and to really be your true authentic self in whatever you're communicating. And then at the same time, to take some of the learnings of more recent times about learning how to express the truth with kindness and compassion, and the giving people the benefit of the doubt when possible, but the truth nonetheless. So finding ways to be authentic as you do your ethical will. Are there any questions or comments about that? I meant to say before, if you don't have to hold all questions to the end. Okay. So, yes.
I have a little bit of a question on this authentic self, and a lot of I remember in college zeroing in on the philosophers like Heidegger who talked about authentic self. But then as I grew older, and even let's look at the people running for office. What is true? Because you can look at them from this angle and it can be all negative.
Mm-hmm.
You can look at them from this angle and it be all positive. So isn't truth how I look at them? Not how I look at something, not like knowing how something is.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Do you ever find an authentic self?
Okay, so those are very big and great questions. So I think the summary of it would be, is there ever truly an authentic self? And how do we know what the truth is about a person? So if you're looking at another person, really all you can, to some degree you can know what they're willing to share with you. And also, we all pick up on nonverbal cues all the time. So even though, there are times when I am talking to a patient at the hospital and their mouth will be saying something, just fairly commonplace, but their eyes will look incredibly sad. And so, and to some degree, what's happening in that interaction is, for whatever reason, their first choice is not to talk about their sadness, even though that's authentically what they're feeling in the moment. And so sometimes what I might do is I might say, "You look sad. Are you feeling sad?" And then they have a choice. They can say no and go on with whatever else they were saying, or they can say yes and then talk to me, I think, probably closer to the core of what is truly going on for them in the moment. So from the philosophical sense, because you were raising that, kind of what is truth in a philosophical sense, I think that when we're talking about ourselves, we do the best we can. So I think what I try to do when I'm trying to be authentic is I really question, what are my motivations here? What is it that I'm trying to get across? Am I trying to impress somebody? If I'm trying to impress somebody, then I'm probably presenting a self that's a little bit different. Am I trying to get them to have a particular emotional reaction to me, whatever that might be? Or am I really trying to communicate what's in my heart? And the closest, I think, to the authentic self is that place where you're trying to communicate what's in your heart and not trying to get to a particular outcome. So if you were thinking of writing an ethical or spiritual will, what would you want some of the elements of that to be? And then I'll write that down. What would you want it to include, kind of in categories? Yes?
Your values.
Values, all right. And we had the gentleman back here who said he wanted to know more about his ancestors. So something about that. For me, I happen to know because my father told me how my family got the name Klein. And it was basically that my great-great-grandfather, who's before Jews had last names, was called Tevye the Kleiner, which basically means Tevye the little guy, right, a small person. And then when Jews were required to have last names, he figured, okay, we'll go Tevye Klein, okay. So something about ancestors. Yes?
You could probably help me articulate this. I would want them to understand what a day in a life is, or a decade in the life was, in a historical context. In other words, my grandmother scrubbed her clothes like this, right? And of course, I don't have to scrub my clothes. So, so some kind of understanding of, the context within which I lived, to understand the challenges. That's an awful, you can probably state that all better, but. Maybe it's, how the world acted on me kind of thing. I'm not sure how to say it. Which then, of course, is about how I responded to that. I don't know if all that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So you're talking about what I called historical and material context, and how did the world affect me? So some examples of that might be, I think for all of us, one of the historical turning points in our lifetime was 9/11. And I mean, for some of us, we're here in California. If we were here in California, maybe it was not as big a deal. But for some of us, it was a huge deal. Maybe we were in New York, we knew people in New York. We knew people who we've been affected by the wars that have happened since then. So that's an example of historical context. And then when I was thinking of material context, I mean, we're all in a position to say, how did we ever function before cell phones or computers? And we don't need to, I'm not saying you need to cover every bit of detail, but there might be some stories there that do give people some idea about, what are some of the things that were really, a way in which that was really meaningful to you. I mean, I know that for me, I think differently now that I write on a computer than I used to write when I wrote longhand. And, and I feel like that has changed me. And one of the things that I notice about when I'm with my niece and nephew and my brother's family is it's almost impossible to get through a conversation without somebody taking out their smartphone and either taking a call or checking something on Google and getting me an answer to something. And so sometimes that's really useful, and sometimes it can lead to, in my opinion, we don't go as deep emotionally sometimes because we stay more on the surface of distraction. So if we're passing along values, we can, to some degree, for example, we can pass along the values of the pre-cell phone era. Okay. So if you could take one and pass these around. So these are the handouts for you to have. And actually, let me just keep one of them. So the first item in the handout are elements of a spiritual ethical will, and so you don't need to write any of this down. You'll have it. So it's things like lessons you've learned from life. We've talked about that a little bit. And lessons you've learned from ancestors or family members, family and personal history, ethical, spiritual, personal values. And my spiritual values, that could mean I gained a lot from belonging to the congregation I belong to, and this is what I gain from being in that community. And spiritual values can also mean be forgiving. I'm thinking about it in that sense. Be forgiving, yeah. Have a way of being in the world where you try to forgive people frequently and quickly. That's a potential spiritual value that somebody might hold. Also, sometimes in spiritual or ethical wills, you might write something that you weren't able to write or express in some other context. And so some of that might be statements of forgiveness. Who do you want to forgive, or who do you want to ask for forgiveness, and expressions to people of love and gratitude. And then also some people use spiritual and ethical wills for funeral and burial instructions. Although I would say, just for a little practical side note, if you're going to do that, make sure people either know how to find it quickly after you've died, or you give it to somebody before you do, if you actually want any of that to be followed. So what I'd like to do now is to give you some examples of spiritual wills, and ones that have actually been written. And I'm wondering if there are a couple of people who'd be willing to come up and help me with the reading, so you're not just hearing my voice. So is there? If not, I can just read them myself. But please come on up. Yeah.
You're not tired of hearing my voice?
Yeah, that's fine. One more person want to come up and do a little bit of reading? If not, we'll just switch off. Okay. Okay, so, and you are?
Judy.
Judy. So Judy, I'm going to give you the first one to read, and I want to give a little bit of background. So this book is called Hebrew Ethical Wills, and it's on your list of resources on your sheet, and it's really remarkable. When it says Hebrew Ethical Wills, you can see literally it means that you have the Hebrew and the English side by side, and these are wills that are collected from as early as the Talmudic era, which some of which are before the Common Era, and up through about the 19th century. And so this is a will from Joel, son of Abraham Shemariah, not a famous person. It was written in 1773, although he died in 1799. And so, sometimes people think, well, the only time to write a spiritual ethical will is shortly before you die. And I would actually say that the time to write it is well before you're in that state, because you probably won't have the energy. And if this is important to you, the time to do it is when you have energy. So, and he lived in Vilna. And let me just see for a second here. Okay. Okay, so Judy, if you could read here, down there, and just to these two lines.
Okay. It was oft my way at assemblies to raise my eyes and regard those present from end to end, to see whether in sooth I loved everyone among them, whether my acceptance of the duty to love my fellow men was genuine. With God's help, I found that indeed I loved all present. Even if I noticed one who had treated me improperly then, without a thought of hesitation, without a moment's delay, I pardoned him. Forthwith, I resolved to love him. If my heart forced me to refuse my love, I addressed him with spoken words of friendship until my heart became attuned to my words. So, whenever I met one to whom my heart did not incline, I forced myself to speak to him kindly, so as to make my heart feel affection for him. What if he were a sinner? Even then, I would not quarrel with him, for I wonder whether there exists in this age one who is able to reprove another. On the other hand, if I conceived that he would listen to advice, I drew near to him, turning towards him a cheerful countenance. If, however, I fancied that he would resent my advances, I did not intrude on him. As there is duty to speak, so is there a duty to be silent.
Okay, thank you. Whoops. Thank you. So, so is there anything anybody noticed or wanted to comment on about that little excerpt?
He gave us an example of, well, forgiveness, I guess. So that was how he approached the problem.
Right, yeah, so it gave an example of how he approached forgiveness. And one of the things that I liked about it is that it had some specificity to it. So if you say, try to forgive people, that's all well and good, but here, his children can imagine, he goes, he looks around the whole room, he checks it out, he says, okay, do I really love everybody here? And if he doesn't, he sees somebody he's mad at, he tries to forgive them right away. So it really helps to bring to mind, brings him to life in a sense. I mean, I didn't, obviously none of us knew him, but I can kind of imagine him sitting in a congregation and looking around and saying, am I okay with everybody in this room? And and when you think about it, what a lovely way to enter into being in a religious space. To first look around at the people who you're praying with and say, am I in good relationship with everybody? Okay, so now I'm going to. Your name is? Joanne. So now I'm going to ask Joanne to read something from 2007, and this is a spiritual will I found on the internet by Sarah Jane. And so this is an example of an insight gleaned from a turning point in life. Go.
The whole thing?
Yeah.
August 5, 2007. Dear Alyssa and Suzanne, August 1, 2007 was a life-changing event for me. I was driving my usual route home from a work-related meeting in Shoreview, crossing the bridge on I-35 West. The traffic was slow because of the repairs being made, and my car clock showed it was 6 o'clock. I patiently waited as traffic moved slowly on the bridge and finally arrived home about 6:20. My phone was ringing as a friend was calling me to ask if I was watching the news on TV. I told him that I had just got home and he said, turn it on. It was then that I realized I had made it over the I-35 West Bridge by just 5 minutes. As Senator Amy Klobuchar has expressed, quote, a bridge in America just shouldn't fall down, unquote. But one did, and it collapsed in Minneapolis. Once again, I am reminded how precious life is. So, my beloved daughters, Alyssa and Suzanne, this blessing is for you, to reinforce and hope you will never forget how important today is. Give thanks for today because we don't know what tomorrow brings. Happiness and hope can quickly turn to sorrow and loss. So please make sure not only say your thank yous, but share your inner feelings of love and values. Don't wait. Seize the moment. Smile at everyone, no matter where paths cross or whether friend or stranger. Your inner radiance is God's gift for you to share, and make it your obligation to illuminate the sky when darkness is all around us. We don't always grasp what we have or who we are until it is almost taken from us. So please, be present. Don't hurry through life forgetting to say, I love you. I love life. I love you, your mom, Sarah C. Jane.
Beautiful.
Thank you, Joanne. Does people remember that when that bridge fell down in Minneapolis a few years ago? It was quite amazing. Yeah. So yes.
Was that a will, or was that a letter to her while she gave it to her daughter while she was still alive?
Yeah. So she gave it to her daughters while she was still alive, and she wrote it. It's dated August 5th, 2007. So she wrote it 4 days after this experience, which was on August 1. So she wrote it right away. But where I found it was on a website of ethical wills. So she, since she had to give permission for this to be on it, she clearly thought of it as an ethical will. And so what, yes?
So one doesn't have to wait till one's dead for your kids to read the letter.
That's right. Yeah, and one doesn't have to wait till you're dead for your kids to read the letter. And what might be the advantage of that?
Because you talk to them.
Yeah.
They can, well, I would assume, it would improve your relationship.
Yeah. So yeah, it can improve it can deepen your relationship. You can start the conversation. I heard some other comments around here.
Application of the principles that she suggested.
So they can talk about the principles. Yeah. And I'm sorry, we were.
Ask the questions. A big story like that inevitably over time will evolve questions about who knows, and why or why not.
Yeah, so I think I know where you're going with that. So you were saying it starts to open up the questions, and the question being, why did she make it over the bridge? Why didn't other people make it over the bridge? These are questions that people often have when they go through life-threatening events. What are they meant to do? And clearly, one of the things she felt she was meant to do was to write this letter to her daughters. Another thing that strikes me about this letter is if she had just written, if she had been inspired and just had written the last paragraph, and I won't read it all again, but it starts with, give thanks for today because we don't know what tomorrow brings. So this paragraph, if you read it all on its own, you really could dismiss it as a list of cliches almost. But because it's preceded by this very particular lived experience, and also because if she's writing it just 4 days later, she's really still in that kind of liminal space where she's really being thankful that she's still here. It really gives those statements so much weight because of that. So yes, you had a question in the back?
No, I don't have a question.
A comment?
I agree totally with what you're saying. I think it's also kind of that inside of the brain chemistry thing that's going on. Just like you state with your younger siblings or relatives with the cell phone, there's no depth to the connection. This is something that is really very, very deep. And I think reading it a decade after it's written is not going to have the impact while somebody is still alive, while you can still have the depth of the emotion, of the experience of what it is that somebody's going to pass on.
Right, so the key is to try to have these sorts of conversations while they're still fresh for everybody. I'll call you 1 second. I just want to say that I had an experience recently with a colleague who came and told me that a relative of hers had been diagnosed with cancer and had a very terrible prognosis. And he was an attorney. And I talked to her about this concept of ethical wills, and she brought it to her relative, and he'd never heard of it, loved it, started doing it, and what ended up happening was a piece of the last weeks of his life was the whole family engaging in these conversations that had came up because he started drafting this document. So yes.
Yeah, she said cell phone, that was my cue. I'd like to apologize for my cell phone going off.
Oh, okay.
I forgot to turn it off.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
So here and then in the back, yes.
Well, I think maybe you added to that, but I was going to ask if you could speak a little more to the format and timing of doing this, because this is obviously of great depth. I'm just not sure that sometimes if you send a letter to somebody and they're very busy and they're out of town, and that it's taken with the gravity that this was meant. So the timing and how to make sure that it's received as an ethical will.
Okay, so the question is about timing and making sure it's received as an ethical will, especially if it's just kind of done in the midst of life, let's say. So first of all, when you were talking about it's something that, I think you said also that it's something that can be quite extensive. I mean, one of the things I think that is remarkable about this is it's just a few paragraphs. So it is something that you can do in quite a short amount of writing space. In terms of timing, I think that taking the opportunity to write when the Spirit moves you, and maybe figure that you'll do it several times, and maybe even you'll change what you've written. And so then in a way it becomes not just for other people, but it's also for you. And then in terms of trying to ensure that it's received with the gravity and care with which you have composed it. So that's such a difficult thing. I just want to acknowledge that. And we don't have complete control. And I think that what we can do is maybe kind of do it in a twofold way. One is to do the best we can to create the circumstances where it could be really received well. And so what that means is maybe say, I'd like to share this ethical will that I've been writing, or the spiritual will that I've been writing with you. When might be a good time for us to sit together and talk about it, so that you're not trying to shoehorn it into something else. And then know that just like everything else in life, there's only so much we can control about that. And so that what you might do is, in addition to trying to share it in the moment, to put it with your important papers. And so if you haven't been able to have that good conversation before you die, it's there for when, sometimes sadly people are slowed down enough to really take in what somebody else has to say. But to try both ways, because I do like the idea of trying to have some of these conversations while everybody's still alive and you can all deepen it together. So yes, in the back.
My event, like the Minneapolis Bridge, happened while I was a medical officer in Vietnam in 1971. And I was heading back to my home base, and I was waiting for a helicopter. And the helicopter, just before my helicopter took off and ran into a plane that was coming into land, and all the people were killed. And I've often thought, I was very fortunate to be on the second helicopter.
And he never told me any of those things.
Until today?
Until that was good.
So okay, just so everybody up here, I'm sorry, I'll repeat it. So the gentleman in the back said that his big turning point, his experience like this bridge experience, happened when he was a medical officer in Vietnam, and he was in a second helicopter that was traveling, and the first helicopter just in front of him crashed, and he was so grateful that he was not in the second helicopter. And are you his wife? His wife said she'd never heard that story before. So is there a life lesson that you took away from that experience?
To be lucky.
It's good to be lucky. All right, well, thank you. And thank you for sharing your story with all of us. So there's another hand up front here, sort of toward the front. Yes.
Language is so important, and simplicity feels important. The difference between the ethical wills was a couple of hundred years, of course. But it's also true that if it's, the simpler it is, the more likely, it seems to me, to be able to be absorbed. If it's a complicated story, somebody might listen.
Okay, so yeah, so you're in favor of simplicity. So that's a great segue to the next will, and I'll read this one. Hang on one second. So this is from So That Your Values Live On, Ethical Wills and How to Prepare Them. And out of the whole book, I picked this one because it has a theme to it, and it's relatively short, and it's very simple. And at the same time, I think it has a lot of depth to it. And well, we'll talk about it after I read it so you can see. So this will is written by Sam Levinson. Anybody hear of Sam Levinson?
Yes, he's a wonderful comedian.
Right. Okay, yeah, talented comedian. So this is kind of somewhat funny. He had something called The Sam Levinson Show on CBS television. And so he signs it. Okay, so it says, this is his ethical will and testament to his grandchildren and to children everywhere. I leave you my unpaid debts. They are my greatest assets. Everything I own, I owe. So here's his list. 1, to America, I owe a debt for the opportunity it gave me to be free and to be me. To my parents, I owe America. They gave it to me, and I leave it to you. Take good care of it. To the biblical tradition, I owe the belief that man does not live by bread alone, nor does he live alone at all. This is also the democratic tradition. Preserve it. To the 6 million of my people, and to the 30 million other humans who died because of man's inhumanity to man, I owe a vow that it must never happen again. I leave you not everything I never had, but everything I had in my lifetime. A good family, respect for learning, compassion for my fellow man, and some 4-letter words for all occasions. Words like help, give, care, feel, and love. Love, my dear grandchildren, is easier to recommend than to define. I can tell you only that like those who came before you, you will surely know when love ain't. You will also know when mercy ain't and brotherhood ain't. The millennium will come when all the ain'ts shall have become ises, and all the ises shall be for all, even for those you don't like. Finally, I leave you the years I should like to have lived, so that I might possibly see whether your generation will bring more love and peace to the world than ours did. I not only hope you will, I pray that you will. Grandpa Sam Levinson. Yeah. And just so you can see, I mean, this is how long that is, and a lot of simplicity and a lot of depth, and it also, Joanne, when you were talking before about trying to give it a sense of historical context, right? So, you know, in that very brief will, you have embedded the historical context of immigration, of the Holocaust, of living in the United States at a particular time, in you know, a certain kind of aspiration toward a certain kind of justice and equality, and you know, all embedded in very few words. So the last one that I want to read from is from this a book, which currently is a PDF, but I understand I'm colleagues and friends with Shohama Harris-Weiner and Holly Blue Hawkins, that they're going to turn this into a full-on book. But it's currently available as a PDF on the website Reclaiming Judaism, and that resource is also on your paper. And from this one, I noticed that a number of ethical wills talk about how to engage with your religious tradition. And so this is an excerpt from the spiritual will of another friend of mine, actually, Rabbi Jan Salzman. And this was written probably in about 2007 or 2008, so very recently. And so this is what she has to say in the part of her will which deals with her hopes for her children and religious tradition. It is my hope that you will continue to identify yourselves as part of the Jewish people, if not for your own sake, but also for the opportunity that it may afford your children, who, even more than you do, may need to find a faith tradition which resonates in their deepest beings. Wrestle with the texts. Remember to gather for Shabbat dinner and Pesach, that's Passover. Find communities who will celebrate the other holidays in ways to which you can engage. Better yet, become a leader in those communities and help to create a Jewish tradition which retains its vitality. If you find yourself feeling distant from our heritage, try again later. You will change as you grow older, and so will your spiritual needs. Practice reading Hebrew every time you attend a service or at home so that you won't forget your training. Try other paths to spiritual awareness. With Jewish intentionality, chant, dance, drum, study, make love, immerse yourself in the natural world, spend time with the elderly and the young, and humbly learn all that they can teach you. So there's an example of a mother who is giving some advice to her children. And I wonder if, in hearing it, if you hear what might some of the differences be from that example I gave you earlier, either Jacob or the woman who left her daughter many letters after she died. There's some differences in how Jan expressed herself.
More flexible, I think she gave some direction but was not too specific.
Right.
And introduced the concept of, if it's not right once, try it later.
Right. Yeah, so she was flexible and open, and I think that she had, there was that rock bottom value there, that she wanted her children to have some kind of engagement with Jewish tradition, but less so about the details, and also, and this is something I think that a lot of us can relate to, this idea that sometimes there are things, and not just religion, but there are ways of being that we reject in certain decades of our life, and then in later decades we pick them back up again. And that's part of the wisdom that we have to pass to those who come after us. Okay, so now we're going to do another exercise. So this book is also in your resource guide. So this is a book by Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi and Ronald Miller, From Aging to Saging, A Profound New Vision of Growing Older. And while this book is not explicitly about creating a spiritual will, it is a book about eldering, which is something really that we're, in a way, a piece of what we're talking about when we're talking about creating an ethical will is, you're taking on your role as an elder in your family, as an elder in society. And so what are some ways that we can model that? And so this exercise is also a way to focus you on a certain kind of turning point. And so it's a testimonial dinner for the severe teachers. And the way that Reb Zalman talks about it is you would really have a whole dinner party, and you'd have several of your severe teachers. And what he means by a severe teacher is maybe somebody who caused you a tremendous amount of grief, maybe hurt you, or made you very angry, or kept you from following a path in your life, or caused you to fail in some way, you think, any of those sorts of things. And now you look back on that and you know what happened next, what happened as a result of, maybe one door in your life being closed, what opened, or what did you learn from being in this very difficult or even broken relationship. So we're not going to create a whole dinner party. We're just going to have one person for dinner. And so, and the other, before I go into the exercise, that it's also, if you remember, I was saying more at the beginning of our time together that in reading these various ethical wills, that I had hoped that people would say, here's a mistake I made and what I learned from it. So this isn't necessarily about a mistake, but it is about how have I learned from adversity. So settle yourself a little bit, because this exercise I think will be a little bit more emotionally challenging. And so call to mind just one dinner guest, one severe teacher, someone who has wronged you in some significant way. And first just write the name of that person, that one person. And then write a very brief description of the injustice you feel was inflicted on you by that person. And then write, and this is in your handout, so if you need to go back to it or look at it later, it's fine too. So describe, let's just say, one unforeseen benefit or unexpected good that resulted from their actions. So the last two parts of it I'm going to invite you to do later, and I'll just describe them here. So the next part would be to say to the offending party in your mind, I understand now that you did me a great deal of good by your actions. And when you did, and name what that was, didn't give me that promotion, whatever, for which I want to thank you. I understand now that it was difficult for you and it was difficult for me. But now that I forgive you, I am grateful for your contribution to my life. Now, before we go any farther, I would just want to talk for a minute about forgiveness, because I have no idea what you wrote. And it could be that somebody in this room wrote something which is actually kind of unforgivable. And so I want to talk just for a moment about what forgiveness means in this context. So let's say for a moment that you have written down something either that you're not ready to forgive, or, in the sense of really being face to face with somebody and say, I forgive you, and let's, be in relationship with each other in whatever way again. Or let's say it's something that is, pretty unforgivable, whatever that might be to you. So I'm not suggesting that you use this as a tool to re-engage maybe with somebody who has hurt you in a horrible way, or to forgive somebody when you're not ready to forgive. When I'm talking about forgiveness here, I mean laying down the burden of your anger enough so that you can kind of take a more panoramic view of your life and be able to say, this happened to me, whatever the this is, and looking, and even though I might not want to be in relationship with that person anymore, I can now see from the passage of time that I actually did learn something from what happened. And so that's what the forgiveness is about, is just laying down that burden of anger. It doesn't mean you need to go say that statement of forgiveness to them personally. And then the last piece is to consider how you might have contributed to that difficult relationship or situation. And because sometimes when we're in the moment, like let's say we've gone through the breakup of a relationship or a divorce, when we're going through it at the time, it's all the other person's fault. It's all them. And then, we step back after the passage of some years and we have other thoughts. Maybe we have thoughts about how we contributed to the tension, or maybe we have thoughts about how, that relationship wasn't really working anyway, and why didn't I take the initiative to step away from it? Sometimes we just end up having other thoughts. So if you discover in reflecting on your own piece in a bad situation, forgive yourself in the same way that you forgave the person who was your severe teacher, so that you take a difficult episode in your life and you start to integrate it more, so that it's not just a painful memory, but that it becomes part of the quilting of your life in a way that almost adds to its beauty, even if it was a difficult situation. So the forgiveness pieces we won't do as a group, but I invite you to do them later. Is there anyone, going back to the first parts of it, who wants to share what they wrote about somebody who was a severe teacher for them and what they learned from that experience? Yes.
I took a very simple one, my first job, and call him Charles, and I thought I was applying for one job, and I was, and when I reported for work, it was an entirely different job, something that I didn't feel I could do well, and but as you go through here, what did you get out of it? What was the benefit? Well, I had enough money to support myself enough and get on my feet so that I had a chance to get another job that was more suitable. And I realized I had not asked enough questions or pinned him down enough in the beginning before I accepted that job. Some months before I finally reported to work. And I made a special friend with that job, so that was a benefit. And questions, should I have quit sooner? Still lingers, but that could have been done. I don't know how much more benefit that we afforded, but it's a good exercise to go through to see that there are good things that happen despite the bad things.
Right. Yeah, so I want to, did everybody hear that? Just because we're running short on time. Did everybody hear that description of the job? So I wanted to say something about memory, because here it is, you're talking about a job which was not the...
5 years ago.
Okay, a long time ago, 55 years ago, and not the job you had bargained for. And when you look back on it now, you see that you made a friend who is still a friend, or was a friend for a while. She's died, okay. So, but somebody who was a very special friend in that job. So there's something about how our brains are formed that this exercise can help to counter as we look back over our life. So we have a tendency to remember the times of danger and the times of difficulty and the times that maybe there was some kind of a threat. Like in your case, maybe it could have been the threat of losing the job that you didn't want, or, and the reason that we tend to do that is that we had a long period of our existence as humans that if we didn't have a very good category in mind of where the threat was or where the difficulties was, we could get eaten by a tiger. Right, so if we spent too much of our memory thinking about the pretty flowers, that might not work out so well for our long-term survival. And so, but what that means then is that it can be easy to kind of look back and just see all the hardship. And so this is an exercise to help you kind of circumvent that wiring, or maybe since we now believe in neuroplasticity and the way that by thinking we can actually change our brains, it helps you to think back in a way and reintegrate the good parts so that you're not just thinking about the hardships. Is there somebody else who wanted to talk about a severe teacher? No. Okay. So let me just see. I can't. Okay, so we are 10 of. All right. So I need to close in just a couple of minutes because there's another class coming. What I wanted, we don't have time to do the last exercise, but it's in your sheets, and it's kind of the flip of this, which is, who would you invite to your reunion of benevolent teachers? And this could be a way, I mean, we've been talking a little bit about, well, do you need to wait, use this as like a last will and testament that is only opened after you've died. And the benefit of thinking about the people who you have appreciated, if they're still living, once you've made that list, even apart from doing this ethical will, you could write them. You could write them now. You can tell them now that they would be part of your reunion of benevolent teachers and why. Yes?
If they're not living any longer, you could write to their children.
That's a wonderful thought. Yes, if they're not living any longer, you can write to their children. Yes, that's absolutely right. And I think that I'm familiar with some of that from there are people who survived, for example, in parts of Germany and parts of Eastern Europe during the Holocaust only because of the good deeds of the non-Jewish people around them. And I've seen some of those kinds of letters being written in that circumstance. I mean, I realize that's a very dramatic circumstance, but you are now a descendant of that person. Let's say you're the Jewish person. You're a descendant of that person only because of the good deeds of the people who saved them. And there have been some really marvelous reunions of children where they kind of both share this history in that way. So that's another good example. Are there any final questions? All right, well, thank you for coming.
Thank you.